Will Cowling. Welcome to the 7th episode of David Anderson Talking Market Data. I'm so glad you are on this podcast, not least because you and I have been friends and colleagues in the industry for a long time, but definitely friends. And you and I have been talking about this idea of podcasts and a podcast for the market data industry for a long time. And I finally had the courage and the time to actually do it. So welcome and thank you for being sort of helping with some of the ideas behind that.
Thanks, David. I'm very pleased to be invited in what I believe will be a very successful podcast. In fact, I believe that we were in the airport lounge in Amsterdam, is it Schiphol?
I
In
think it was
Ja-
Amsterdam.
January of 2023, where you were telling me about with enthusiasm, your um, ability to use technology for YouTubing and so on and so forth. And I said, why don't you do a podcast? And you said, well, it's a good idea, but I'm off to Sydney and then I'm off to here. But anyway, absolutely fantastic that you've now launched it
Yeah,
formally.
yeah. And it's interesting, that conversation I remember having with you, because I do love all the technology, my microphones, I've got lighting and the technology I'm using to pull this together. It's all quite fun. And as a few of my friends and colleagues have told me, David, you do like the sound of your own voice, which I do. So I'm playing up to that. But I think you're right. It was tricky. There was a lot going on, so I didn't have time to do it. But now that I am quote unquote semi-retired, and this, for all the audience, and it's worth noting, this is the retirement bit of being semi-retired. This is my fun, my passion project that I'm doing. I'm still continuing to do work for FISD, which a lot of people will know me through. But I stress that this is David Anderson's voice, not FISD. This is me doing my own thing here, but I still continue to work with FISD, but on a 50% part-time basis as I ease myself into the latter years of my career. A youngster like you, Will, has so many more years before you, but I'm slightly, well, I'm supposed to be slowing down, but then I find I'm doing this, which I'm speeding up again. But hey, that's all the fun of it. So yeah, I mean, you and I were chatting thoughts on podcasts. I mean,
Well, I think the stars are aligned for you for the reasons you just mentioned and others. I was mulling it over this morning and I thought of, believe it or not, 8 reasons why this is going to be a success. I think there is
hit me with them.
well, number one, I think there is a demand within our industry, within our market data
Yeah,
industry, for a podcast. I mean, there are some out there, as we know, from Waters or corporate podcasts,
yeah.
but there's definitely room for another one, and there's definitely room for one which is coming from your area of experience. So that was number one. Number two, and this is what I said to you back in the airport in Amsterdam, you're one of the most globally connected people I know.
It's all those aeroplane rides to Sydney and Buenos Aires and New York and whatever.
Well, I know you love to travel,
I
and you
do.
still love to travel.
I do.
Well, you and your wife. How many countries have you visited?
Oh, I haven't counted them all up. Although I'm slowing down a bit now, and I'll get a poke in. I'm a bit annoyed with British Airways at the moment. British Airways have changed their whole loyalty program, and I was very proud of my gold status. That I had a spreadsheet to actually work out how to achieve my gold status without spending vast sums of money. And now British Airways, being the commercial organisation they are, they're saying if you want gold, you have to spend vast sums of money. So they've spoilt the game for people like me. So
How many countries have you visited approximately?
I will write in the notes. You've now challenged me. I'll have to actually write them down and count up how many there were. I think it might have been in 2023 when I visited 7 new countries in that year.
There you go.
It was in one year I did
seven new countries in 2023.
Yeah, that was it was India, it was Argentina, it was Cyprus. Anyway, we won't bore the audience with that. Okay, so hit me with some more of your.
Well, where are you? Well, I guess finally, where are you planning to visit in the future? Because you've always seemed to have a list of places
Well,
you're visiting in the future.
with FISD, I'm doing an engineering stream in New York on April the 8th. There's a little plug. Anybody who wants to come and see me in New York on April the 8th. I'm going to Singapore to do our AsiaFIC event on May the 29th and 30th. And then I'm taking on a holiday afterwards. We go to Bali after that in Singapore, very, very civilized. Then I'll be on an engineering stream in Chicago on September the 24th. Oh, I'll be back in India, Bangalore, doing my training course. I'm still doing my training course. If anybody out there would like a 3 half-day training course on the market data industry with David Anderson in person and 7 hours of me on video e-learning, I'm doing that. I'm potentially going to Porto to teach that, to Dublin, maybe to Korea, maybe to, well, definitely, I think, to Bangalore again. But travel, I love it. So,
I think my point, listeners, is well made.
okay.
So the third point is, as you mentioned just now, you've got less time with FISD, although you're still involved. So that does release you to do the podcasts. But it's worth mentioning what a great organisation FISD is, particularly under
Absolutely.
Tom's leadership. And his leadership's been superb, I think, over the years.
Oh, and I've worked with him, must be for 15 years now, and it's been a pleasure. FISD is a fabulous organisation to work for. Again, if anybody, I'm probably going to put my LinkedIn profile on this, so you can see my 40 years in the industry. But the last, good 15 of those have been with FISD, which is a great organisation. Not for profit trade association for the entire industry. The United Nations of the market data industry is how I. So Tom's Secretary General, isn't he, of the equivalent of the United Nations?
I think it's a fantastic organisation. We're very fortunate. And related to that, the fourth reason it's going to be a success is your skills as a moderator, because
Well,
I think you'll need to provide, or
yeah,
naturally you'll provide a balanced view
yeah,
when
and I keep my guests in
presenting.
check and make sure they don't go off at a tangent. So I'm watching you, Will.
And in fact, in going back to FISD, that's one of the things I've always admired about the organisation is the quality of the chairmanship that Tom and his team provide to not just the
I
conferences, but the conference calls.
Yeah, no, I'm I it's slightly sad that I'm doing a bit less with them, but I'm not going to say goodbye. Again, another conversation for another podcast. How does one retire? Should one retire? But that's a conversation for another day.
Do you play golf?
I don't. I
In that
don't. So
case, you
so this
carry on
this is my
forever.
hobby. This is my golf.
The fifth reason was you're very well connected. I don't know how many connections you have, but everybody seems to know David Anderson.
Well, and that is helping with this. And look, I'm reaching out to a lot of my contacts, like your good self, Will. As we say, this is the 7th. I've got an 8th tomorrow, and I'm expecting many, many more. But I open my arms. If there are people out there who would like to appear on this podcast, then please get in touch with me, because I want to expand that. I know a lot of people. I'm going to talk to a lot of people to invite them. But hey, there's always new people to meet out there.
There is. The sixth reason was your interest in technology of podcasting.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
what equipment do you have now?
Well,
I
I've
know
got
you've
my
spoken
my
about.
Shure microphone. I've got my face cam up there. I've got an Elgato key light. I'm using Riverside FM, so it's all fun and games. I've got multiple. I don't know. I won't bore people with how many microphones I've got. That's half the problem. Is I sometimes get muddled which microphone I'm using. And the great thing about all of this is my wife says, "Isn't it fabulous you're spending so much money on this?" She says, "Keep spending. It's such a good use of our family money."
I imagine the expense is relatively small.
It is.
The and you said the software you have, you just press a button and it can remove ers and ums.
And ums and edit. There's so much technology out there, which is AI effectively, improving sound, improving video, enabling people like me to do these podcasts in a much simpler way. So it's an exciting area.
The seventh thing that came to mind was you have a good understanding of the varying aspects of market data. And you
40
mentioned, in
years,
fact,
40
40
years.
years. working in the industry, presenting the
Yeah,
industry, and obviously doing
yeah,
the training courses.
indeed, indeed.
And the eighth, which you mentioned earlier, is that you speak very well. You have the actor's voice.
Oh well, well, I like the sound of it as well. Probably a bit too much. So, but hey, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper and all that.
I'm
All
envious. It's something I always wish I had had.
Well, you do. I think you do. Anyway, let's not get too self-congratulatory. But I think you do have I've listened to you before on things we've recorded, so you can do more, and I will have you back as a guest on this more because I don't think we're going to get through everything today. That first little snippet I'll probably cut out and make an advert out of it for this podcast. So all good fun, all good fun. So look, let's talk about you. Please, I always do this. Please give me, us, the audience, who is Will Cowling? I know who you are. Who are you? And you're currently working for IRESS Quanthouse. So give us a bit of explanation and background to that. Give us the Will Cowling story. Also add a bit of where you, I mean, I first met you when you were at UBS. Give us a little bit of the brief background and then where you're currently at.
I've had two long stints at global financial institutions. Firstly, HSBC, then UBS, where I was managing market data administration, market data compliance, and demand management. And then I've recently consulted for UK, French, Swiss, Japanese, USA banks. Plus, I've consulted for vendors and I've consulted for exchanges. And then very recently, as you just alluded to, I've been looking after exchange relations and market data compliance for Quanthouse, which and with where my ultimate focus is assisting clients.
And Quanthouse, which I recall was a French originating organization, got tuned by IRESS, which is a more Australian, Canadian, South African, I think. So what's the IRESS Quanthouse story?
So Quanthouse is a subsidiary of IRESS, but very much self-contained, and it's a real centre of excellence, headquartered in Paris,
Right.
France, and when their excellence is the delivery of exchange data. And so in the
Sort of low
truest
latency, low
low,
latency being
low
a
latency, absolutely. But it's not just the low latency that people want now. People want more the confidence that the delivery is going to work and there's not going to be too much maintenance on the client side.
okay. And where does Quanthouse fit with IRESS? Stop kicking the desk.
Oh, sorry. It's just simply a subsidiary, but obviously they're connected in so much so that Quanthouse delivers the data to Iris as well.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. So
The and but so the final thing to say about Quanthouse, because I've enjoyed working here, is that in the truest sense of the word, it benefits from the traditional French excellence in mathematics and engineering.
indeed. Yes, absolutely. That is one of France's claims to fame or whatever. So excellent. Well, look, I mean, I hope, and you and I have chatted about it. This is, and will be delighted to have more people from the Quanthouse and or Iris family. I know several people in that organisation as well. So I'm looking forward to having more conversations with your colleagues as well, and I hope more conversations with you. And again, I think it's interesting. I'm very conscious in my experience with you over the years. You're somebody I've definitely turned to for broad market data expertise, but I'm very conscious of your deep expertise when it comes to exchange data. And segue into the first topic that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a couple of topics, but the first one that I want to talk about is core market data in general is complicated, and the licensing that goes with that data, the selling of that data. You don't buy the data in its entirety, you buy a license to data. And there is an enormous sort of cross section of different types of core data in the market data world. When I use by the way, when I use the phrase market data, I mean all the data, any data that the market might want to consume. That's my personal definition of it. some other people, and they're not right and wrong, it's just different ways, refer to market data as being just that pricing data that comes from an exchange or something. They're not wrong. That's just one way of looking at it. I look at it in the entirety. So there's this big lump of complicated market data, core market data, whatever. And then there are specialist elements within it, which I think we're going to come on to. But the big question is firms out there want to comply with those complicated policies. They might from time to time have some disagreements about those, and that's another conversation perhaps for another day. But if a firm wants to comply with the multitude of complicated policies that it is signed up to from many, many different data suppliers, exchanges, etc., why is that so difficult? I mean, it is. I know it is difficult. Can you describe and categorize the difficulties?
So, yeah, I agree with you about market data being everything data, but core market data I would
Yeah,
describe as being four categories. One, regulated trading venue data,
yeah,
which is commonly often referred to as exchange data.
yeah,
Two, rating agencies data. Three, index provider data. And then
yeah.
four, numbering agency data.
Okay,
And then
yeah,
from a financial market perspective, these are the core must-have uh, products that most financial consumers buy or
and
consume.
your word core means that there are non-core stuff that is nice, maybe nice to have, useful to have, but if you don't have the core stuff, you probably can't even start.
Exactly. I mean, there's other stuff which is almost core, but you don't have to have it. For example, you don't have to have research, you don't have to have news, but you don't have to have a terminal. You don't have to have a data feed, but you do have to. Most financial institutions I've worked for, they do have to have regulated trading venue data, rating agencies, index providers, and numbering agencies.
And I think we're going to talk about compliance with that. But I was having another podcast with a mutual friend of ours, Caroline Poisson from Chain IQ, and we were talking about procurement. And with those services that you have to have, that creates a headache for procurement because it does rather constrain and limit one's negotiating abilities. If one has to have something, that really ties your hands if you're a procurement specialist. But I don't think we're talking about the procurement dynamics on this podcast. I know you're very familiar with that.
So yeah, so absolutely, it's the because it's must have, then the demand is inelastic, and the providers aren't monopolistic, but they have monopolistic qualities. Which,
Yeah.
from a procurement's perspective, when you're dealing with something and your demand is inelastic, means the benefit of the negotiation is with the provider as opposed to the buyer.
And you and I could talk about that as well, but I think the focus is on putting that to one side and looking at the situation. You have signed up for these services, and that means your firm has to comply with those policies. Talk us through the dynamics of that.
Yeah. So from a consumer's perspective, the better inventory you have related to core market data, the better you can optimize the value you receive. That's the number one thing, making sure you have the inventory. However, um, gathering the inventory, particularly in the 2020s and beyond, is becoming more and more difficult. And I'll go on to explain that in a second. So if we look at the four categories, if we first off we look at exchange non-display data. So in the last few years, there's a disconnect, in my opinion, has occurred between entitlement systems and the licensing terms that are applicable.
Right.
Um, if you if you want an analogy, the ship that is the data delivery and the data content used to be tethered to the dock that is the commercial license via entitlement and inventory systems. However, that ship has become untethered And best case, the rope has become frayed.
And I mean, it's something I'm very conscious of, and the way I've heard it described is, or this, it's this concept of, look, whether we agree or disagree with the fact that XYZ provider wants us to pay for data in ABC format, if our systems are entitlement systems, which are things like the old Refinitiv data access control system, DAX, and then I always get my letters wrong, EMRS, I think it is, from Bloomberg, and then DART, there's a few out there. But if those, and then the inventory systems like the TRG screens and the MDSLs of the world, if those systems, those tools, just are physically incapable of understanding or interpreting those new rules, if you're sitting in a consumer firm, that's painful. That's
Yeah, I
worrying.
think it is a issue that I believe the industry needs to fix, not just the consumers. It's for the benefit of all the industries to fix. So let's talk about the particular issue. So in particular, core market data licensing requires consumers to declare not only what is the data is available to them, but also how that data is being used. So it is the need to classify type of use, um, which the industry needs to fix.
And those types, a type isn't adding and subtracting. A type is in risk management or in trading in a business context. Is that your understanding of that type?
So for exchanges, the non-display type of use are generally proprietary trading, agency trading, trading platforms, which is where you operate almost as an exchange, creation of derived data,
Yeah.
and then there's this other category, which also redistribution. But in relation to the other category, that other category is becoming slightly more granular each year. For example, instead of everything being thrown into other, you might have risk management as an additional category, or portfolio trading as an additional category. So these are all these types of use. So from a licensing perspective, not only do you need to know what data is coming into your organization, but you need to know how you're using that data, and you need to match it against those types of use. And
And
that's the bit that's generally missing. I mean, there's some of it within the consumer firms, and there's some in the inventory management suppliers supply it to some consumers, and some consumers have built their own system, but in general, it's missing.
and yeah, it's interesting because I'm aware that quite a few exchanges recently, mentioning no names, have been issuing out big questionnaires to their customers about how they're using the data. Not necessarily in relation to the current contracts, but again, being a cynic or whatever, people are saying is, excuse me, are people, the providers of data trying to understand how this data is used in a more granular way, so that they can come up with pricing policies that are more granular. That seems to be the direction. Because I recall when non-display first came out, and this is probably 10, 15 years ago when the non-display concept was first introduced, it was just a lump. If you, as a bank ABC, if you want to take non-display data from exchange XYZ, you pay a single lump sum of money. And more recently, the exchange XYZ is being concerned that they're not earning enough money because that they want to charge 5 different lump sums of money. Is that how it's evolved? Have I understood
Yeah,
that?
that's part of it. So splitting the lump sum, as you call it, into granular things will allows the regulated trading venue or the other core market data providers to optimize their revenue, which is, you know, that's their prerogative. But also there is a demand from consumers of differing sizes saying, well, I'm much smaller than this large bank, I shouldn't be paying as much as them. And though the only way as a market data provider, as a source provider of core market data to deliver that is to split it up into granular amounts so that you can charge different customers different amounts
But
depending on
that's
size.
you've almost got a matrix there, which is interesting. You've got the concept of big and small and a spectrum there. And then you've got another spectrum, which is complex or non-complex. So you could, in theory, have a very big organization with a lot of trading activity, but only does one thing, and therefore it only has to pay for one of those categories. You could have a big organization that's got lots of those categories, but you could equally have a small organization that also has lots of those categories. So is it the big and small dynamic, and or is it have you got a diverse and complicated business?
I think it's all of the above. Yes, it's an
Yeah,
imperfect world. There isn't a completely proportional licensing structure out there.
yeah,
But these are the but the issue that we need to solve is, given that we have these different types of use, given that inventory systems are not fully capturing it, given that entitlement systems are not capturing it, um, we need to work as an industry to put in place something that does allow consumers to categorize their data by different types of use.
I mean,
So then they can remain fully compliant.
don't the existing, I mean, I'm ex Reuters, so I remember DAX. I mean, DAX would enable an organization to permission an application, because when you talk about business uses, when you translate that into practical terms, it's probably some sort of application or a server. It's some bit of software that is dedicated to proprietary trading, and another bit of software that is dedicated to agency broking, and another bit of software that is risk management. And therefore, if you can track the data going to the prop trading application, then you know you've got to pay for prop trading. If you can track another bit of data, and you as the consuming firm can switch that on and off. Doesn't that work already like that?
Uh, yes, if it was a simple data lineage such as that, but for large organizations, large consumers, what normally happens is they'll have multiple vendors delivering data into their organization, and then they'll receive that into an internal distribution platform, and then they'll distribute that out to other applications or to other display users, and then those other applications will redistribute it out to other applications, and you soon end up with quite a complex situation within a large organization. And each of those applications potentially will have a different type of use, and each of
Yeah.
those applications will potentially be using different types of data, different data products, different exchange products.
And I mean, so that's that is a problem that many consumer firms are wrestling with. Out of curiosity, where you sit, you sit in what I would colloquially or collectively call an aggregating data vendor, because you've got the original sources, the exchanges, the original data providers who often will send their data directly to a consuming firm, but they will also often route that data via an aggregating data vendor, which Quanthouse IRESS is. So, in terms of the problem that you've just identified, where does an aggregating data vendor fit with all that? I mean, isn't there a potential duplication, multiplication? That's the word I'm looking for. In the sense, XYZ exchange could have these different policies, and if their data flows through an aggregating data vendor, then the aggregating data vendor needs to replicate those policies all the way downstream to their consumers. But then the aggregating data vendor might have some additional policies itself. So how does that all play out?
Well, simply term, an aggregating data vendor delivers a data feed to a client, and then the client redistributes that themselves internally. Now, the aggregating data vendor can and does provide entitlement systems to help the client, and can and does provide clients with assistance understanding exchange policies and core market data vendor policies. But ultimately, it's on the client, it's on the consumer to be able to manage their inventory and manage their type of use.
Now we
The
we were we were chatting about the wonders of podcast technology and what have you. I mean, is technology going to ride to the rescue for this problem? I mean, is it the technologists that we turn to create solutions to address this problem that people are wrestling with?
Yes, but before we get there,
I'm jumping ahead.
before we get there, I think we need to build the foundation, or the consumers need to build the foundation, and the industry needs to help them to build this application inventory. So, very simply put, the consumers need to have a full inventory of all of their vendor applications and in-house applications. They need to understand what data each application is using, what data product they're using. And then for each data product, they need to understand what type of use each application has for that data product. And remember, every exchange is slightly different.
Yeah.
Although we've spoken generally about trading and proprietary trading and agency trading and other, in fact, you can't just speak generalized. If you need to fully comply with licensing, you have to be specific. So you have to say, for this particular exchange, their types of use that we have to comply and report on are this, and this. Therefore, we have to capture that in our inventory system and associate it with this application. And we also have to say, where is this application redistributing the data to?
Yeah.
And then after you capture where that application is redistributing the data to, then you need the inventory for that application to say what data that's receiving, and then what type of use it is. And then gradually you've crawled through the organization and you've got a full inventory of the data you're using within your organization, the products you're using, and crucially the type of use.
I
So
mean,
in answer to your original question, can technology help? Yes, but we need to build that foundation first.
we need to understand the problem in a very logical, structured way before we build technology that will suit it. And I think I might have misunderstood or missaid. Inventory is an interesting word. I mean, whenever I hear that word, I think of inventory management systems for the data, which are things like, the TRG, and Screen got together, got Informatch, and Fits, I think, two different products, and then you've got MDSL now owned by Calero. So there's a long-standing subsegment of the market data industry that is inventory management. But you're talking about something slightly broader than just that, actually having an inventory, a map of all the systems and all the applications that ABC Bank is operating. Is that?
Yeah, the data lineage. Now, the inventory management suppliers, the ones you mentioned and others, they absolutely can and are starting to build these systems. Some of them have them already. Some of them are enhancing them.
Right.
There's new firms coming into the industry that are building these products, but I don't think they deliver these. Not everyone buys these inventory management
No.
products.
Well, all you
I don't
need
know.
is a spreadsheet, bit of
And
paper.
well, actually, a spreadsheet's enough. But what I'm saying is every consumer in the industry needs something.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we have there's probably a subset of the consumers have an inventory management system. I mean, a minority, not a subset.
And so the problem has different elements. One, not everybody has a full-on inventory management system, and also there's inventory management systems do an excellent job for what they were designed for, but there's other things going on now prompted by the nature of the policies and how things like exchanges, index providers are charging for the data, and that might require new systems, new software, whatever, designed to work with that. I mean, another question: we've talked about these use cases. We prop trading versus agency broking, risk management, whatever. But are those terms, those descriptions, universal and unambiguous? Does everybody refer to it as prop or proprietary trading? Does everybody refer to agency broking? Does everybody refer to risk management? I mean, the use cases absolutely defined and described in the same way?
I think you know the answer to that. They
Well,
are
I was giving you a nice. I think I do know the answer, which is no.
They are not. And as you've discussed and others have discussed, achieving a industry standardization on this is, I think, is generally accepted is now not possible. Um, so therefore, for each exchange, for each regulated trading venue, for each product, you have to capture the particular type of use for each product. And so therefore you end up with hundreds, actually probably thousands of combinations, which you have to capture in this add-on to an inventory system, this application inventory, which includes type of use and data lineage.
So what? I mean, that problem exists already. Are the different parties, be they the consumer customer firms and the exchanges, for example, are they reaching a compromise where they say, look, this is what we want to track and this is how we want to charge you for all of this, but we do recognize that actually you can't, it's not you won't, you can't structure your entitlement systems and your inventory systems to match that. So should we just have an agreement, an approximation to what you're probably doing? Is that the fudge in the interim? What is the fudge in the interim?
And we possibly might be in that fudge zone or that transition zone. I mean, conversations, the way to achieve this is having the constant dialogue back and forth with the consumers, saying to the core market data providers, if we're going to comply with these different types of use, we need help creating the inventory system so that we can capture our types of use.
I mean, that's interesting. Is it who's going to build these new systems and services? Is it third parties? Is it a whole genre of new companies that pop up, or that do this, or is it the data providers, the data customers? I'm trying to think. There's so many players involved in this. I suppose there's two elements: who does it, and by does it I mean who builds it, and then who pays for it.
So, I mean, it'll be multiple parties, no doubt. My personal wish would be if there was that the consumers were provided with a well, at least at its basic level, a free of charge template to say these are the list of products, these are the list of types of use, and the exchanges provided it to them, and then the consumers could easily well, not easily, but they could then start populating it, and then they could feed back to the exchanges and say, this is our type of use.
But
Because at
you
the
you
moment, what happens is the exchanges say, tell us the type of use, and the consumers have to scramble around doing snap audits to say, okay, we think it's this, but it's not continually maintained. And so
but
actually, when it comes to a formal audit, it's, I hesitate to say the impossible, but it's almost impossible to do because the auditor's got nothing to look at when they go to the consumer.
But I think you skipped over something innocently just then. By the exchanges said this, and we need to tell the exchanges as if the exchanges is a singular entity. When it's not. It is as the S on the
Yeah,
end. It's
you're
multiple.
absolutely
So
right.
if
Yeah,
it was one exchange coming with its rather complicated new set of use cases going to one customer, that in itself would be a complicated conversation.
it would. You're
But
right.
it's
You're absolutely.
multiple exchanges,
Yeah,
always slightly different concepts of business cases and everything. I mean that's the theme I've seen throughout this. It's in a bilateral sense, exchange A talking to customer B, that can be a complicated conversation in itself. But when you've got exchange A, B, C, D, God knows how many of those, and different customers, it just and then you throw in aggregating data vendors in the middle of that, and then you throw in inventory management companies like Calero and TRG Screen and whatever, and there's an interesting cottage industry of all these different players, and I'm going to speak to them, I think, on my podcast. The TRG Screens of the world, the Caleras of the world, the Expands of the world, the 3D Eyes of the world, the Jordan and I mean, there's quite a little collection. Is that where we're going to, Vendex, a newer player? Is that where the salvation is going to come from? That cottage industry?
it may be. Yeah, I think the only disincentive of that is that you have to buy those products, and so. a couple of hundred, maybe a few thousand consumers will buy those products, but there'll be another 10,000 that won't buy anything. So
But
we
don't
really
you?
need something for the whole industry.
But don't you have to buy? I mean, I'll tell an anecdote, and I did it on the other podcast. So if you watched a few podcasts, I'm repeating my anecdotes. So apologies to listeners. But it was the anecdote when I was talking to somebody on the customer side, and they were describing a problem. It could have been this problem, but it was a problem. And I said, well, just go to some vendors and explain it, and they'll probably build something for you. And that person said, but they'll charge me for it. But isn't that the nature of business, that a customer group has a problem, and if they describe it and explain it to suppliers who work with them, one or more of those suppliers will design a solution, but that supplier will then want to and need to be paid for it. Isn't that just normal business? I mean, I'm struggling to understand this free of charge layer. Why should it be free of charge?
So remember, what we're talking about is only an understanding of the inventory system for related to type of use. That's the thing that possibly should be free of charge. Why should it be free of charge? Well, why? I don't think it necessarily will be, but why it would be nice if it was free of charge is because if you're, I bought something off you, I paid a license off you, and and then you say I've got to pay by different types of use, and then you say, well, to me, well. I say, well, I don't know how to capture that different types of use. So, as a seller of that data to me, I would hope that you would give me some sort of help in how to classify and how to capture my different types of use.
And what? So your nirvana, your perfect world would be, that exchange, for example, when it's coming out with these policies, then providing a layer of service and support or explanation, whatever it is, to help the customer comply with these newer, more complicated policies. So that in a sense, it's like, the customer saying, yes, Mr. or Mrs. Exchange, I understand you're doing this. Maybe I don't like it or don't like it, whatever it is, but I need some more help. I need something additional to enable me to comply with you. And I look to you to work with me and help me on that.
Yeah, so I think the industry needs to help. It's the benefit. It's the benefit of the core market data provider as well as the consumer is to the benefit of all. Now, you did mention technology providers. We did see, as you know, at WIFIC in Austin, DRDM presenting at one of their stands, and that has potential. I thought that has potential to
Well,
help.
guess who my podcast guest tomorrow is?
Oh, is
It's
it
somebody
Alan Ross?
Alan Ross.
Okay.
So episode number 8. This is going to be a nice segue into
Well,
that. And
perfect.
so you think what Alan is doing, and I confess he's a good friend of mine, but I haven't fully understand his new idea. But you've seen it in detail, and you know this issue much better than I do. So is there
I
some
think
hope
I
on the
think
horizon?
I think it has potential. I mean, you don't know until it's a fully developed product. But I think it definitely has potential to. I mean, it's digital contracting, but we have this three-way, sometimes four-way conversation between vendor, consumer, exchange, and intermediary, where
Yeah.
everyone needs to know the licensing terms and the level of inventory and the declaration. And why is that taking weeks, days to go back and forth? Why can't we just have it in a central distributed ledger and all interrogate it instantly? Which I think is potentially what DRDM Alan is saying can provide. Or having said that, Alan may say that's just a small part of it. It may do
Yeah.
lots more. When you speak to him, he'll tell you.
I when he speaks to the audience, because he'll be on, and I think that reminds me as well that I've been with my FISD hat on. I've seen, this is pre-COVID. I think this was 2019. The whole digital rights management concept that came up, and I think I can say, because it's public knowledge, this was driven a lot by Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and Refinitiv as it was then, and it was working on this whole the whole ODRL concept. And one of the guests I will have on at a future podcast will be Ben Whittam-Smith from Deontic. I haven't asked him, so he may not want to be on, but I think he would be another person who pitches a solution. Again, I haven't seen any of these solutions yet be universally accepted, universally embraced as the solution. So I'm waiting to see the solution, as I think you are. So
Well, I mean that was and is a good idea, but even that I think would rely on the consumers having the inventory to be able to map their systems to ODRL and therefore map to the licensing. So even that needs that foundation.
and I think, I mean, it's a pleasure having you on this podcast, and Alan, to my more independent, smaller vendors who are not as bureaucratic. I'm hoping I can get some people from the big banks, maybe some from the exchanges, to speak to this topic. But again, by their nature, they have a slightly more organized, structured, dare I say it, bureaucratic approach to allowing people to speak in public on some of these topics. But I think we need them to speak. To solve this problem, we need people talking. And I don't think there's anything secret. Again, I don't think Caroline will mind me saying this because it's recorded. I was saying, well, all these different providers, they're all trying to make as much money as they possibly can. We know that. Doesn't make them evil. And I think she disagreed. She thought there was some evil tucking away there. I know friends who, it's very frustrating. But at the end of the day, it's businesses, and there must be a compromise to be had somewhere on the lines. Look,
Well, I mean,
yeah.
going to that point, having worked at banks for many years, it's very difficult. They say quite clearly to their employees, you are not allowed to speak to press. Anything you say has to go through corporate communications.
So
Um,
I'm holding my breath. It'd be interesting to see whether I can get some of those voices. What I might do is I might talk to them offline, really make sure I understand the issue. And then whether I voice, as a devil's advocate to other people, maybe we can illuminate the topic without having those people speaking.
well, with your work with FISD, you must have come across
Well, I think,
the
and there's
difficulty of
some,
getting banks
yeah.
to be on panels.
And it's difficult. People are nervous because if they happen to say the wrong thing. The good thing about this podcast, is I can edit stuff out, before it goes public. You can't do that if you're on on a panel or what have you. Will we?
But
Yeah,
before we
yeah,
end the subject, we should pick. We spoke about the different types of use of regulated trading venues. We
yeah.
should, for completeness, if you don't mind, also mention the different types of use for the other core market data providers. So
Shoot.
we mentioned rating agencies.
Yeah,
So
credit rating agencies we're talking about. Yeah,
credit rating agencies. So consumers have the unenviable task of trying to capture where ratings are used within their organizations. And
yeah,
remember, there's almost often no entitlement system relating to
yeah.
rating agency data. And then linking it to parameters such as assets under management.
I know
And when you
that.
think about that, where do you put that in an inventory system?
I know. I mean, it's these different concepts were dreamt up, and they seemed sensible when over a cup of coffee they were all being discussed, and then the practicality of it, I know, is enormous angst. So yeah. So
Uh, so,
credit.
so, so, so yeah, then thirdly, obviously, index providers we mentioned.
Yeah,
So you have to understand the family of indices that you're buying. Okay,
yeah,
that will be an entitlement product, so that's understandable. But you also, as a consumer, you get charged depending on your consumer brand that's using the index. So each consumer will have their own branding names, and each branding name will have to pay an additional fee. That's a different type of use. So where is your consumer brand captured in your inventory system? And then also, this is a common thing, consumers have to, in relation to index providers, have to classify the different business activities.
okay.
But there is no universal agreed list of what a business activity is, and especially globally. What a vendor in America thinks a business activity is to a consumer in Hong Kong or Germany or the UK may be a very different thing.
Well, again, pro non-pro is something that I've heard mentioned a lot. Very different concept in America to Europe and what have you. I mean, I fear in a good way that each of those topics is a podcast or more than one. You know, the complexities I know because FISD has a separate working group just on index data, a separate working group just on the credit ratings. I mean, each of those is a meaty topic, just in
It's
its own
absolutely.
right.
And for completeness, we should mention the fourth, which is numbering agencies.
Yeah, which is
And I think you talked to one of your other guests about that.
well,
You were saying.
Tim Baker's very vocal on all the goings on that have occurred about CUSIP of late. I'm neutral to this whole discussion, but there is an argument going on. There are legal cases going on in America, and again, you were very helpful explaining to me. I think on a trip we had to Frankfurt recently. We've seen a lot of each other, and when we have downtime at those, it's when you could educate me. So thank you for those educational.
I think I,
Yes,
I think I think all I said in relation to education is again uh, that for the numbering agency data, you have to, as a consumer, know your different types of use to comply with the license. So you need to know the number of unique identifiers that you're benefiting from, not in fact not in fact entitled for, but actually benefiting from. You need
right.
to know the line of business that using that data. And again, then we get this issue of what your source provider thinks is a line of business and what you as a consumer thinks is a line of business. And then you also have to know the number of regions using the data. And remember, this numbering agency data is often unentitled. So how do you capture unentitled numbering agency data that's spreading throughout your organization with those three parameters? Very
And when you
difficult.
use the phrase unentitled, you mean the classic things like DAX or EMRS from Bloomberg don't
Yes, there's no.
involve themselves in that.
Well, no, they don't. There's no PDP code to say
Yeah.
permission me for this ISIN code. It's ISIN is just a field associated with the security.
I mean, it's something I'm very conscious. There is a big debate on. Again, you can separate the two issues. One is the rights and wrongs of it, and there's a big debate going on, and even a legal case about the quote unquote rights and wrongs. But then just operating under the umbrella of the existing regime is really difficult because the existing regime is complicated. No, it's again we need to come back to that because I think we just touched the surface on those things at the beginning of the podcast. You said, "Are you sure we're going to need an hour to talk through?" We've only done one of the topics, but we could talk for more than an hour on any of those. So I think it's coming back to them, and I would ask the audience to feed back to me where you the audience would seek more information, more discussion on, credit rating and the licensing, the index and the licensing to do with that, numbering agencies and symbology, etc., and all that relates to that, and exchange data, and tell us what you want to hear more about. I think, and we'll respond. So that's a segue. We could have talked more and more about all of that. The other thing that we had on our list, and again, unit of count. I'll just say it because I think unit of count relates a lot to what we were talking about non-display. In the old days, 40 years ago, when I joined Telerate as a salesman in London, it was green screens, which were dumb terminals. And literally, you paid, well, you pay five of those, or six, you pay for six, or 10. You paid for how many terminals you had. I think there was some additional charging for extra screens, a slave screen or something like that. But there were physical things, these green screens, and that's what you paid for. We used to use the horrible phrase, pardon my French, bums on seats. I think the other one is eyeballs. But then data feeds came along, I remember even when I was working in Telerate back in the 80s, Telerate's SOP, Standard Output Protocol, and there was Reuters dynamic cache feed, RDCDF. Dynamic, I can't even remember what it stood for, but they were page-based feeds. But all of those data feeds then created this new concept we've already talked about, which is non-display. And that in itself, all of that then creates this problem. what does one count? The providers of data want to charge in a granular way that can scale so that they can get more money for more use. That's a very simplistic way of saying it. And I presume the customers acknowledge and accept that if they use things more, they should pay more. But there's not really agreement or understanding of what more means. Unit of count, as the phrase is, well, what are the different types of, how do you count? What do you count?
So let's try and break it down into the two categories that you just mentioned. So we'll have a look at the unit of count for display,
Yeah.
and then we'll look at the unit of count for non-display. So the unit of count for display has evolved into three broad types. Number one, per user, where user is a natural person. Number two, per user per source, where the user is a natural person and the source is the information provider. So the aggregating vendor, as you said earlier. And number three, all potential instances. So all potential instances is when you have to pay for every vendor that's delivering data to you as a person, and all potential times you can log into that data. So those are the
In fact, you've
three unit of counts that.
well, let me probe you on just that bit, because I think it came in that latter bit you were talking about, the concept of netting and MISU, multiple instance single user. Is that the right phrase?
So for the first two types we just mentioned, so per user and per user per source, there is netting. For the third
From
type,
some, not all exchanges. Is that?
well, not all exchanges offer per user, and not all exchanges offer per user per source.
Yeah.
So that if they don't offer per user or per user per source, then the default is all potential instances. So, but if they do offer per user, or if they do offer per user per source, then there is the concept of netting. So let's take per user to start with. Then the netting you're doing is netting down to all of the sources and logins of potential instances available to a user who is a natural person. And you're netting that with using your inventory system, you're netting that down to one person. Now, you mentioned Mizu. Mizu is just a particular method of doing
Of netting.
per user netting,
Yeah.
only used by some North American exchanges.
Right.
And it's an administrative technique where you declare all potential instances, and then you get and then you send in a Mizu report, and you get a credit back for the difference. So the exchange does the netting for you and then credits you back.
Got it.
It's a bit of a cumbersome administrative process. It's easier for a consumer to net it within their inventory system and then just declare the number of users and then get invoiced based on the number of
But
users.
you also used a phrase when you talk about user, natural person, as if they're the same. But then isn't there also this use of the phrase login? If you've got different login ideas, I mean, it's very pertinent since COVID. The idea, Will Cowling is a human being. I believe you're a human being, the last I looked. And you sit in front of you're in the office with your backdrop of London, the Gherkin, I can just see through the back there. But then from time to time you work from home, and you've got a different computer at home, and therefore should you pay twice, or because your login, your password, your login, you can only log in once. Well, there's an interesting, just to make it complicated. If the system, if you're sitting at somebody else is sitting at your desk, and they switch on the computer, and they've stolen your password and your login, and they log in, and they're Fred Blogs, and then you log in at home, and if the system says no, you can't log in at home because you're logged in the office, or some systems aren't as clever as that, and they will let two instances of Will Cowling log in on two separate locations. My head is hurting just even describing this.
Yes. Oh, the one thing I should say that actually particularly banks, they're very good nowadays at not allowing people to steal username and passwords.
Yeah.
But that aside, your head still hurts because you have already started just in your couple of sentences to see how technology has advanced so much that counting all potential instances is very difficult. And it's not just, I mean, if it was just counting logging in from home or your mobile device or the number of applications you had, that would be easy. The difficult thing is how many times can you potentially log in? So I can potentially log in 10 times. So that means I now have to pay 10 times.
It's a complicated matrix. And I mean, this unit of count, I suppose, are modern entitlement systems able to track all of that and to do the entitlements in a way that reflects the policies that the different exchanges or the different core data providers have? I mean, does
I don't
it,
think in that regard, I don't think entitlement systems have changed much really in the last decade.
right?
They they provide a login. They will restrict the number of accesses that the user of that login is allowed to log into, and that's it, really. They don't. But bear in mind what we said earlier, that what happens is that then data is redistributed by a data platform into another application, and then that's redistributed into other applications, and all of those applications downstream throughout the matrix within the organization, they may not necessarily have that advanced entitlement system
I mean,
associated with them.
we could go down the rabbit hole on this one. I'm conscious of time, and therefore we are going to have a repeat. An episode, another episode of Will Cowling at some point. But just whetting people's appetite. I mean, we haven't even talked about APIs, desktop APIs. I know there was a big controversy, and I think this is pretty public. I'm not criticizing, but Bloomberg had the SAPI and the DAPI, the server API and the desktop API. Um, and there were, the desktop API was if you extracted data for your own use at a desktop, that was what the desktop API was. And the server API was perceived to be sitting in a server that multiple people would potentially look at the output, and therefore there was a different charge. But in a physical sense, if you're a single Will Cowling sitting at his computer and extracts the data via DAPI, but then because he's on a network, he's able to send that information to his three colleagues. Physically, that feels like a desktop API, but it's actually acting as a server API. And I think there were enormous arguments about that, I
Yeah,
recall.
but leaving aside the server desktop element of it, which is probably in technological terms irrelevant, the we're still stuck with this concept of counting devices,
Yeah.
and that does go back to the days of the green screen. So, what in 2025 is a device? I'll ask you, what is a device?
I mean, I would attempt, it could be, well, I've got a computer, I have got a physical computer sitting under my desk, and I used to have a laptop, and then there's a screen. But then I remember there were confusions about what is it, you're counting a CPU, but then you have multiple CPUs on a single physical device. Now, I don't have the answer. Again, what is a device? What is a desktop? I use that phrase, but desktop's a pretty vague phrase. I don't think we've got time, frankly. I'm conscious. I brought all up that complexity, but I think we're going to need to come back to that. And maybe offline, we're going to talk about it in a way. How can we better explain this? Again, I don't think with this podcast, I'm trying to solve the problem. I want to explain the problem.
Yeah.
I think,
So, in the interest of explaining, we mentioned there was the unit of count for display,
yeah,
which we mentioned the three different general types, but we should mention the unit of count for non-display.
yes, please.
So that non-display also needs counting nowadays. So we have the firm, and as you said initially, non-display fees were just per firm, so that was relatively easy to count. But You also may have to count a non-display fee per server,
Yeah.
which is in fact extremely difficult to do. You can imagine the amount of servers that feed servers within organizations. You may have to count non-display fees per application, or have this concept of entitlement to applications. So the amount of times you can log into an application, these need counting now in relation to some non-display fees.
Wasn't
And
there also
you also need
lo-
to count business type.
wasn't there also location? Site. So if you were XYZ Bank and you had a midtown Manhattan big building and you had a downtown Manhattan building and you had a London building, there were some instances where that was three locations, and that,
Yes, it could be. Could be location, and you could also legal entity may be something you need to consider.
yeah, because Bank ABC has buy side, Bank ABC Asset Management as another company.
But so maybe this won't help, but just consider this as something we need to solve in the future as a closing remark on this issue. And you mentioned to it earlier in relation to APIs. Why is a market data terminal that has the ability to download data via an inbuilt API into Excel or into
Yeah.
something else or into a Sheets or into anything? Why is that classified as a display device? Why is that not a non-display application?
I suppose simplistically and arguably wrongly, because there is a display, because it also displays, but effectively that device is providing a display opportunity and a non-display because I
And
think that
in fact, to go further, why, if a market data terminal has the ability to carry out calculations, or you can install an add-in or an additional software within
yeah,
your market data terminal, why is that? Why is that soft? Why is that a non-display, not a non-display application? I think possibly you could argue that these traditional market data terminals could be non-display now.
I look, there's other anecdotes I could tell. I remember when Reuters changed from dumb terminals to intelligent terminals, and an intelligent terminal was a PC. And in the old days, Reuters would have people driving around in white vans, and if any Reuters terminal went wrong, and instantly somebody would turn up and they disconnect it, reconnect it, and you'd be up working again. That was fine in dumb terminals. But then suddenly those engineers would come in, supposed to fix a desktop PC that had a lot of its own data, and they'd replace it with a brand new PC. And the user would say, "Well, hang on, I've got all my data on the other one." And it was like, think times had changed, and the way of supporting it. Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk for a long time on that. Will, I want you back. I want to do more on this, and I think you and I'll have an offline chat to work out how we can best construct another podcast. I hope we've explained some of this. I have a horrible feeling we might have also added confusion, not deliberately, but it is difficult to explain this stuff. So I would like to continue to look to explain more on this. So look, as you know, and you've had the benefit of watching a couple of my other episodes on this. I like to finish, and I'm going to do a bit of a pause when we finish. I like to finish with some sort of conclusions. What do you see ahead for the future? Look, get your crystal ball out. What do you see coming down the horizon, the good and the bad? What would you like to see? I suppose there's two different things. What actually are you expecting to see, and the good and bad of that? And what would you really like to see?
Well, data content wise, I'm actually not expecting anything big in 2025. Although it's worth mentioning in 2026, we will see the EU and UK consolidated tape for bonds, and
Which
I think that potentially there could be significant demand for that.
okay,
And I say the consolidated tape for bonds, but perhaps the consolidated tape for equities, there'll be less initial demand. That could be a slower burn. But consolidated tape for bonds in 2026 could be interesting from a data content perspective. From a data delivery perspective, I think the technological industry is already running well ahead of licensing, as we've alluded to in this discussion. And finally, licensing wise, what I hope, as we described earlier, is that we can generally, as an industry, have a collective will to allow consumers to build inventory systems that capture all of their data lineage and their type of use.
I share that. I share that hope, and I hope there's people out there who can contribute and articulate and define that and build on that, so we can get a clear sort of picture on that. I mean, a question I'll throw at you, and something I've watched over my many years in this industry, is M&A activity. I mean, what was there much M&A? I suppose was LSEG buying Refinitiv? Was that last year or was that the year before? I've lost track of time, but it manifested itself in a big way last year. That was a big one. I suppose UBS, your old alma mater, and Credit Suisse, that happened. Do you think that the onward march of M&A? I'm just trying to think where else we might see anything. Are you expecting anything else like that?
I don't think I could say it on a public podcast,
No, you
but
probably can't.
yeah,
Insider
no,
trading or something,
yeah.
yeah. But I don't know. Philosophical question: is all this M&A activity good or bad? I mean, I don't know. I struggle with it. I worry, and I said this on other podcasts that I've done. I worry we've ended up with a marketplace with some massive providers and some massive customers, and I question whether classic market forces, market supply and demand curves and equilibrium and all those wonderful economic concepts, whether they work when you've got big entities on either side of the equation.
I'm gonna duck that question, but I'll answer. I'll answer in a roundabout way. I do come across, and you probably do as well, more than I, lots of new technology firms that are desperate to receive market data, link
Yeah,
it with other market data, deliver it to their customers, provide analytics and deliver it to their customers, but I think are somewhat held back by the licensing restrictions.
I think that is true. Licensing, the complexity as we just described it, is a barrier to entry for many. So I think,
So let's
yeah,
solve it.
yeah, that's a good conclusion. Let's solve it. I think my philosophy is let's explain it first. Let's understand it first, because you need to understand first before you can solve. And this is complicated. My head is hurting, but in a good way. It's a good head hurting. So thank you for making my head hurt, Will Cowling. It's always a pleasure. And as I said, I'm very thankful, and I look forward to getting you back for another episode. And as we've already discussed, I'd love some of your colleagues from Quanthouse and IRESS as well to participate in this podcast.
Thank you. And I look forward to your podcast being a roaring success.
David Anderson talking market data. That's what it's all about. Don't hang up. I'm going to stop the recording.